Hey, how's it going, everyone? This is Derek Clavin, and welcome back to episode 46 of How to Practice Jazz Guitar Efficiently. Now, if this is the first video that you've ever seen on this channel, I'd recommend that you go back to episode 1 and really try to watch the videos in order as best as you can. I know that they're long, but if you really want to benefit, that's what I would do, because this is like a free online jazz guitar course that unfolds in a logical sort of manner and just keeps building upon itself, alright? But since you clicked on this video today, maybe check this one out first and see if you like it, and then you can take it from there. Just a quick disclaimer. So this video today, to me, really turned out to be very much a rant, as if the other ones aren't, right? But in the end, I kind of feel like I was just making the same basic point throughout the whole video and just consistently defending it or selling it to you guys. But regardless, I still think that the stuff that I'm saying is valuable information that you may want to consider assimilating into your whole conception of jazz. And, if you're a jazz nerd like me, you really might find this stuff interesting anyway. But I'll let you know that I am still going to be showing you two different examples of pieces of vocabulary later in the video, and I'm going to break them down a little bit and make some points that relate to this topic that have to do with these pieces of vocabulary. Alright, so if you only care about that, you can skip to whatever time I'm going to put up on the screen now. But if you stick around and watch the whole thing, I really appreciate that, and I hope you enjoy. I'm feeling very relieved today to be done with that last topic, because that was a lot, wasn't it? But it's always a lot with me. Anyway, all I want to talk about today is the importance of acquiring vocabulary as a jazz musician, and my goal is to hopefully help awaken within you a greater appreciation for this kind of thing if you don't have it already. Although I'm sure a lot of you already know what I'm talking about, I'm going to begin by defining exactly what I mean when I say vocabulary for those who may be unsure. For music, the concept of vocabulary is basically the same as it is for any sort of spoken language. It's just that it can possibly exist in a more abstract kind of a way. Whereas you may say that the vocabulary of a spoken language may be a little bit more objective. In a language like English, vocabulary exists in the concrete form of words, and in addition to this, the vocabulary of any particular language can exist either in more of a collective kind of way, where a distinct group of people may speak generally in the same kind of way using a lot of common vocabulary, or in more of a personal kind of a way which considers the unique and specific vocabulary of only one individual. With music, it's the same thing, it's just that what might constitute a musical word may be, like I said, a little bit more of an abstract concept. When I think of musical vocabulary, I like to think of things like melodies or phrases or fragments of those things, or like a motif, and this includes chordal phrases and ideas as well. But vocabulary can still also mean things like any particular scale, arpeggio, or chord. It could be a rhythm, a type of substitution, a particular sequence or pattern, etc. So, as you can see, it's a pretty subjective and personal kind of thing. The idea of vocabulary in music is universal and can apply to all types of styles, and in a way, you may equate this to different kinds of languages. However, jazz music is only one kind of particular music that I think the concept of vocabulary may hold a greater significance compared to other styles, and other styles that I would kind of put in this category as well may be things like bluegrass or salsa and stuff like that. This is just because these styles typically have a lot more improvisation, where people are expected to improvise or create something on the spot within a particular style that may be going over chord changes as well. So you got to be prepared in order to be able to pull that stuff off. Now, like I said, I'm trying to awaken within you a greater appreciation for the importance of vocabulary in jazz if you don't already have it. In my opinion, I don't really think that this subject is actually stressed that much in contemporary jazz education culture, and therefore I think that a lot of people, myself included, can often overlook how much focus and consistency you really want to put into vocabulary. And in addition to something like this possibly happening, and I'm being hypothetical here, but depending on a person's unique life trajectory and experiences and influences, they may possibly go so far to develop an attitude of basically equating things like working on vocabulary to basically only being able to offer you these sort of pre-practiced licks or riffs that you could kind of cut and paste into your solos and therefore not really be that musical. The ironic thing is, even if there are people who are passionate enough about playing jazz to even develop this negative kind of association with the idea of vocabulary, if you were to talk to these people, they still really aren't denying the idea of vocabulary as being something legitimate in jazz music. So think about this, because maybe you could relate. Why would you even acknowledge the idea of something like vocabulary in jazz music as something that would be valid or legitimate in any kind of way if you yourself aren't even realistically practicing things like vocabulary on any sort of real consistent basis, and you have a negative association towards the idea of playing anything that you may perceive to be pre-practiced licks or riffs? Now, I like to consider the other side of things, so if I was going to theorize why people may develop this sort of perception, and it is understandable, but I would say it would possibly be because they're too attached to the idea of improvisation, which is why I preach what I do when I say that I think improvisation could be a dangerous term to an aspiring jazz musician. And in addition to this, everyone may be unique, but some people who think like this may actually agree that it's good to develop your own personally composed, set of vocabulary that you came up with and then use that in an improvisation. But the idea of using any sort of vocabulary that you may have copied from somewhere else would just be too unoriginal and therefore wouldn't really be any sort of great jazz. So I'm just going to challenge these hypothetical opinions now, because I'm trying to persuade you towards, seeing things more so in a different kind of perspective. First of all, if you feel as if you have a negative association in any way at all with what you may perceive to be pre-practiced licks or ideas, and just to be clear, the basic thought process that I'm referring to is essentially pre-practiced ideas equals not actually improvisation equals not authentic jazz or actually being musical or something like that. If you resonate with that kind of thought process at all, first, I would say that's still cool. I would never tell you that you can't think or approach music in any particular kind of way. However, it may really help put things in perspective for you if you were to consider which one of these two things is truly more valuable to you. Do you care more about playing music that truly sounds good to you and comes out as close to as how you would want it to sound as possible? Or do you care more about playing something that is as spontaneous and in the moment as possible, at least to your own perception, because you think that you're playing jazz and you have to be improvising? Keep in mind that when you play for real, these two things aren't mutually exclusive. You could play things that come out exactly as you would like them to sound, that are truly spontaneous. Now, I don't know about you, but for me personally, I care more about being able to play music that comes out exactly like I would like it to sound, no matter how it was generated, versus caring if it was actually improvised or not. In my opinion, it's actually really kind of funny when you think about it. Why do we ever really seem to care if what we play was truly improvised or not, more than the contents of what we might actually be playing? It's not like there's a scorekeeping referee in the audience who is auditing everything that you play and trying to determine if it was improvised or not. So why do we subconsciously let this type of thing influence what we might play in the moment? The only thing that we could objectively say is that If we play something during a performance that was predetermined and we knew exactly what we were going to play note for note before the performance began, then we could say that that specific thing was not actually improvised. Everything past that point becomes subjective and arbitrary whether or not we label it as improvisation. If you've truly listened to and studied a lot of jazz language, you'll eventually realize the overlap, similarity, and variation between endless little phrases and ideas, and it becomes meaningless whether or not what you play was actually improvised or even originally coming from you at all. It's simply just jazz language. The only people who hate on learning pre-practice licks are probably people who haven't done enough of that themselves, so they don't really know the true benefit that it could offer. It's the equivalent of something like saying, I speak English, but I don't need to learn any words in the English language. And think about it, we never say that the words that someone may be using when they speak are unoriginal, because it doesn't matter. It's just the common language that we all use and understand. How many times do we hear a jazz musician play something that we're familiar with and recognize as something that probably originally came from another jazz musician and their innovation that they contributed? Like, for example, hearing some contemporary sax player play some phrases that are very reminiscent of the 60s John Coltrane kind of language. How do most of us react to this kind of thing? We love it, you know? Okay, so I've ranted enough, but I still want to share now some clips from this great video with Hal Galper discussing vocabulary. For those of you who aren't familiar with him, Hal Galper is a great jazz pianist and educator who has played with a lot of the jazz greats like Dizzy Gillespie and Phil Woods and a lot of other people. And there's several videos of him on YouTube teaching various fundamental jazz concepts that I happen to think are very good. I'm not saying that his word is the definitive truth of jazz or that you have to agree with anything that he says here, but check out some of what he says, and if you're interested, I'll link the whole video in the description.
You need the vocabulary to do the process. However, the process itself teaches you the process. In other words, you learn it by doing it, not by intellectualizing it or any other way. In order to do the process, you need something to use, which is the vocabulary. So, the more vocabulary you have, the better you can use the process, the better you can teach yourself the process. This is a music that teaches itself by doing it. But if you don't have the vocabulary to do it, you can't learn it. Next. It's as simple as that. To a lot of people, it appears that there's a dichotomy here, that if you copy the vocabulary, you won't be an individual. That couldn't be farther from the truth. So when you bring your life experiences to an artistic event, and all of a sudden a resonance is created by the artist, by a certain lick or line that you play, that's because the artist found something common between you and the artist. And that's a signal about your conception. One of the biggest mysteries we have is, how do I want to play? What's my style? If you hear a lick that you like, it's a clue to how you feel about music, how you hear. And your responsibility is to take that clue and put it through the ringer. There's something going on when we're learning music that we're not aware of. It's sort of what I call a big picture or a larger understanding of how things work, quote unquote. And you don't realize you're developing it, but you are.
Alright, so I think that speaks to the importance of vocabulary as well. And I especially liked his opening statement about needing the vocabulary to do the process. To me, it basically infers the idea of not having to worry too much about the improvisational process, because if you just do enough of the right consistent work, the process will eventually reveal itself and all the genuine musical improvisation will just naturally start to happen, but you have to put in the work. So, having said all this, I want to now wrap up this video by sharing with you 2 examples of vocabulary, and I'll just make some points about them that I think will further convince you that vocabulary really should be one of the primary things that is prioritized in your practice. And these are just 2 cool pieces of vocabulary anyway. I'll put the music up for the first example so that we could take a look at that one and analyze it a little bit, and there will be a PDF available for the second example on my website and Patreon if anyone wants to take a look at that one, and the links will be in the description. Okay, so the first example is a linear single note melody type of idea. And this particular phrase came from someone else as opposed to me composing it. I've said before that I don't really think it matters too much whether or not an idea was composed by you or you got it from somewhere else once it becomes something that you just practice now, but I'm just letting you know. Now, I still don't want to tell you who originally played this phrase because I don't want you jacking all of my shit. I've given you enough, haven't I? But it's like Hal Galper says, when you're selecting your vocabulary, this can determine your style and everything. And regardless of all this golden information I'm giving you, I don't want you copying my style. But feel free to guess who it may be in the comments. So, the original context that this phrase was played in was over the first 4 bars of a rhythm changes form in the key of B flat, and it goes something like this. 1, 2, right? So, first off, I just think this is a really cool phrase. I like the way that it sounds and flows, and I think that everything that's played in the entire 4 bars fits really well together in a cohesive kind of way, but when we examine it, we could also find these smaller individual phrases within that kind of stand alone as an independent, complete piece of vocabulary. And when you're really practicing, it can often be beneficial to work with these smaller individual fragments one at a time as opposed to working with the entire phrase. Now, first, there's a few things I want to say regarding the harmonic analysis, and this is because, like I say, I'm trying to demonstrate the importance of the actual vocabulary itself, and I think that usually when people don't really agree with this approach, they'll tend to approach things in a way where they're primarily just thinking about the harmony of what's going on, and then they just apply that to the improvisation. Although the harmony can still be really interesting and unique sometimes, of course, but I'm trying to show that it often doesn't really contribute as much to what makes the phrase really stand out as you might think. Now, if you saw my recent video about how to play over the A section of a rhythm changes, you know that I said that we could approach the first 4 bars, which is just 2 consecutive cycles of a 1-6-2-5 progression in the key of B flat, either really simplified and diatonically by just thinking B flat as a basic foundation, or we can play things that really do outline all of the specific changes. We don't need to overthink this right now. We just want to understand what the basic diatonic harmony is. And if you look at the way I wrote the chords out here, they all function in the key of B flat, and they're all truly diatonic to the key of B flat, except for the G7, which is just a common functioning secondary dominant chord, a 6-7 chord in that key. And I just chose to write it like that the second time, and the first time is just a regular G minor, but they're basically interchangeable. So If we look at how all the notes in this phrase relate diatonically, and we're going to start by just looking at the first two bars since I think it stands alone as an individual phrase, we'll see that all the notes except for one are diatonically in the key of B flat major. So, if we look at that phrase, the only thing that's not in the key of B flat is this note, which is just a chromatic passing tone, which functions really just to make certain other notes come out rhythmically correct, so nothing too crazy. In addition to this, if we were to analyze this phrase as if it really was implying all of the chord changes, it starts on the fifth of the B flat major, so that is a chord tone, and then when we get to the G minor or G7, that would be like the 9 of a G7 or G minor chord. And then continuing, when we get to the C minor, same note, but that note is like the 13 or the 6 in relationship to C minor. And then when we get to the F7 chord, we just land on the root. Okay? So it kind of implies some of the changes falling on the strong downbeats, but not totally. So harmonically speaking, there's nothing really going on here that really contributes to the uniqueness of this phrase. It's mostly just a B flat major scale, and it's not even implying any diatonic arpeggios or triads or anything that may relate to the key of B flat major. The only thing that is clear is a G minor 7 arpeggio at the end of the phrase, and that goes over F7, and that does diatonically relate, but it doesn't necessarily define F7. And the strong chord tones really aren't consistently falling properly on the strong beats to create a clear sense of the correct moving harmony. Basically, I'm saying that the harmony isn't really contributing anything unique to the phrase, and the harmonic analysis is just as vanilla as it comes. Now, if we look at the second two bars, this is interesting because we go back to like a B flat, at the start of bar 3, and it starts on this, which would be the 11 or the 4, which is usually not a good note to land on. And the phrase, I kind of see that as really outlining either a G7, like the 6-7, or even like expanding that to like a D half diminished, as if it was a minor 2-5 approaching C minor. So it works, but it's definitely not, clearly outlining what it should be, especially in the beginning of that phrase, which would be like a B flat major sound. And then in the last bar, that 2-5, that's a very cliche phrase, but again, it's not starting on a chord tone. It's starting on the 11 or the 4 of C minor. And it finishes, right? So, if I were to sort of pick out what I think does make this phrase stand out, maybe it'll be the use of those consecutive same notes, like doubling up those notes. And then again, it just creates an interesting sense of phrasing. But even if I had it in my mind where it's like, oh, that's something I want to do, I still don't think that you would be able to produce this phrase. So there's no harmonic tools or any concepts or anything, at least the way I see it, that can lead you to producing this phrase. The phrase is just a cool phrase. Maybe you had it in your head, maybe you can sing it, but the point is it's about the vocabulary and not about the harmony or, these different things that you could do to potentially generate a line. Real quick, I just wanted to point out, because I didn't bring this up, that the rhythmic component of any given phrase or pieces of vocabulary is one thing that I actually do think can significantly influence, what makes a particular phrase stand out. But not necessarily always, but it is one thing that can. And with this phrase here, it's not completely just eighth notes the whole way through, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but if it was, you may not say that there's too much that is rhythmically interesting about that phrase, but you might say that the and of 2 in the first bar that is held over into beat 3, kind of creating a little syncopation there, that kind of, I think, contributes significantly to the flow of this phrase. So that, in a sense, really may influence it. But regardless of if the rhythm has a significant effect on the phrase or not, you really just want to understand that Sometimes, there isn't going to be any particular musical concept or unique thing happening with the phrase that is the reason why it's cool. Sometimes a cool phrase is just a cool phrase. Alright, I want to move on to the other example now. But if anyone does have any comments or questions regarding the first phrase, just put it in the comments. And also, since I didn't say this before, I just want to point out that this video still by no means explains how exactly to practice vocabulary, and I will have several videos that really go into detail on that whole thing, but this video today is really only meant to show you what you may possibly be lacking in your approach if you're not prioritizing vocabulary. Anyway, this next example is kind of like the opposite of the first example in a few ways. This one happens to be a chordal idea that I composed myself, although I don't think that matters much, like I said before, and it goes over a blues form in the key of F. This is basically a comping idea over one full chorus of a blues. The whole chorus, I think, fits together as one cohesive statement, but similar to what we did before, we could definitely break this up into smaller chunks or fragments that can be added to our vocabulary as a smaller unit. So let me show it to you now. I'll count you in, and this is coming in on a pickup of beat 3 before the top, so you'll hear it. 1, 2, a 1, 2. Right? So that's the basic thing. And if you like that, the music will be available. Now, the main thing that I'm trying to communicate with this, again, is that unless you already have a lot of experience and familiarity with ideas like these, there's just no way you're going to be able to improvise ideas like this on the spot. And what I'm really referring to, especially in this case, is like the sequence of voicings that work well together. And you see, the thing is, a lot of these voicings, if you really broke them down and I taught it to you, are nothing too crazy. They just sound good being put together, but they could still be a lot to think about in the moment in terms of like, what chord do I want to put in a certain order and what's coming next. But if you already have it as a piece of vocabulary and you practiced it, you don't have to worry about that. Even if we just take a look at the last 2 bars, like the turnaround when I went something like... Right? It's got good voicing and all that. If you don't have experience, like I said, you're just not coming up with stuff like that when you're improvising, all right? So same thing with chordal ideas. It's very important to, work on bits of vocabulary that you like and they sound good to you so that if you practice them enough, you'll be able to work them into your playing. So I'll just leave it there today. I know that this was very rambly and I feel like I was just repeating myself a lot, but I hope that this could help some people. So, in the next episode,
hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey,
I'm just going to help you by giving you some sources of vocabulary that you may want to check out. And what I'm talking about is telling you who to listen to, basically. So, spoiler alert. But that's it. So, if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you gave it a like and consider becoming a subscriber as well as a contributor to Patreon, where you get all the PDFs for $5 a month. And if you think anyone else would enjoy the content, please share it with them as well. And I'll see you guys in episode 47.
Swinging and playing the blues. That's what we about.
I try to help you.